Problems. A preliminary outpouring from the heart. An old adage, drawn from the external and visible world, says, "Only the one who works gets the bread." Oddly enough, the adage does not apply in the world where it is most at home, where the external world is subject to the law of imperfection. And here it happens again and again that the one who does not work also gets the bread, and the one who sleeps gets it more abundantly than the one who works. In the external world, everything belongs to the possessor. It toils slavishly under the law of indifference, and the genie of the ring obeys whoever has the ring, whether he is Nur-Eddin or Aladdin, and whoever has the world's treasures has them no matter how he got them. In the world of the spirit, it is otherwise. Here, an eternal divine order prevails. Here it does not rain on both the just and the unjust. Here the sun does not shine on both good and evil. Here it holds true that only the one who works gets the bread. Only the one who is in anxiety finds rest. Only the one who descends into the underworld rescues the beloved. Only the one who draws the knife gets Isaac. The one who will not work does not get the bread, but is deceived. Just as the gods deceived Orpheus with an airy apparition instead of the beloved, deceived him because he was sentimental, not courageous. Deceived him because he was a lute player, not a man. Here it does not help to have Abraham for a father, nor 17 noble ancestors. What was written about the maidens of Israel applies to the one who will not work. He brings forth wind, but the one who is willing to work gives birth to his own father. There is a form of knowledge that presumptuously wants to introduce into the world of spirit the same law of indifference under which the external world sighs. It thinks it is enough to know the great. Other work is not needed. But that is why it gets no bread. It perishes from hunger, while everything is transmuted into gold. And what does it really know? There were many thousands of Greek contemporaries and countless numbers in later generations who knew all the triumphs of Miltiades, but there was only one who became sleepless over them. There were countless generations who knew the story of Abraham word by word, by heart, but how many did it make sleepless? Now, the story of Abraham has the extraordinary quality of always being glorious no matter how poorly it is understood. But here again, it is a matter of whether one is willing to labor and be heavy laden. But one does not want to work, and yet wants to understand the story. One speaks in Abraham's honor, but how? By presenting the whole story in quite ordinary terms. The great thing was that he loved God so much that he was willing to sacrifice the best to him. That is very true, but the best is a vague term. In the course of thinking and jabbering away, one quite confidently identifies Isaac and the best, and the meditator can very well smoke his pipe while cogitating, and the listener can very well stretch his legs out comfortably. If that rich young man, whom Christ met on his way, had sold all his possessions and given the money to the poor, we would then praise him, as we do everything that is great, and would not even understand him without working. But he still would not have become an Abraham, even though he sacrificed the best. What is left out of Abraham's story is the anxiety. For to money I have no ethical obligation, but to the son the father has the highest and most sacred duty. Yet anxiety is a dangerous subject for the delicate-natured. Therefore, one forgets it. In spite of the fact that one wants to talk about Abraham, one speaks then, and in the course of orating interchanges the two terms, Isaac and the best, and everything goes splendidly. However, if it so happened that among the listeners there was a man who suffered from insomnia, then the most frightful, the most profound, tragic, and comic misunderstanding lies very close. He went home. He would do just like Abraham, for the son is, after all, the best. If that speaker heard of it, he perhaps went to the man, gathered all his clerical dignity, and shouted, "You detestable person, you pariah of society, What devil has so possessed you that you want to murder your son?" And the parson, who had not felt any warmth or perspiration while preaching on Abraham, would be surprised at himself, at the earnest wrath with which he fulminated against the poor man. He would be pleased with himself, for never had he spoken with such force and fervor. He would say to himself and his wife, "I am an orator. What was lacking has been the occasion. When I spoke about Abraham last Sunday, I did not feel moved at all." If this same speaker had a modest excess of understanding to spare, then I think he would have lost it if the sinner calmly and in a dignified manner had replied, "After all, that was what you yourself preached on last Sunday." How could the parson even get such an idea into his head? And yet it was certainly so. And the mistake was simply that he had not known what he was saying. Yet there is no poet who could bring himself to prefer situations like this to the stuff and nonsense that fills comedies and novels. The comic and the tragic touch each other here in absolute infinity. In itself, the parson's discourse was perhaps ludicrous enough, but became infinitely ludicrous by its effect, and yet this was quite natural. Or perhaps the sinner, without making any objection, actually became converted by the parson's castigation. Suppose this zealous clergyman went cheerfully home, elated in the consciousness that he was effective, not only from the pulpit, but above all with his irresistible power as a spiritual adviser, inasmuch as he inspired the congregation on Sundays, while on Monday he stood like a cherub with a flaming sword before the one who by his action would put shame the old saying that things do not happen in the world as the parson preaches. However, if the sinner was not convinced, then his situation is indeed tragic. He would probably be executed or sent to the madhouse. In short, he would become unhappy in relation to so-called actuality, although in another sense, I certainly think that Abraham made him happy, for the one who works does not perish. How does one explain such a contradiction as that speaker's? Is it because Abraham has a prescriptive right to be a great man, so that whatever he does is great, and when another person does the same thing is a sin, a flagrant sin? In that case, I do not wish to be party to such thoughtless tribute. If faith cannot make it a holy act to be willing to murder one's son, then let the same judgment be passed upon Abraham as everyone else. If one perhaps lacks the courage to think one's thought through, to say that Abraham was a murderer, then it would certainly be better to acquire that courage than to waste time on undeserved tributes. The ethical expression for what Abraham did is that he intended to murder Isaac. The religious expression is that he intended to sacrifice Isaac. But in this contradiction lies precisely the anxiety that indeed can make a person sleepless, and yet Abraham is not who he is without this anxiety. Or perhaps Abraham did not do what is narrated there at all. Perhaps, due to circumstances of time, it was something entirely different. Then let us forget him, for what is worthwhile in remembering the past that cannot become a present? Or perhaps that speaker had forgotten something corresponding to the ethical oversight that Isaac was the son. For if faith is taken away by becoming null and void, all that remains is the brutal fact that Abraham intended to murder Isaac, which is easy enough for anyone to imitate who does not have faith, that is, the faith that makes it difficult for him. Personally, I do not lack the courage to think a thought whole. So far, I have feared none, and should I encounter one like that, then I hope at least to have the honesty to say that I am afraid of this thought. It stirs up something strange in me, and therefore I will not think it. If I do wrong by that, then punishment certainly will not fail to come. If I had acknowledged as true the judgment that Abraham was a murderer, I do not know whether I could have silenced my reverence for him. However, if I had thought that, then I would probably have kept silent about it, for one should not initiate others into such thoughts. But Abraham is no illusion. He has not slept his way to renown. He did not owe it to a caprice of fortune. Can one then speak candidly about Abraham without running the risk that an individual in mental confusion might go and do likewise? If I dare not, then I will keep absolutely silent about Abraham, and above all, I will not scale him down in such a way that precisely by that he becomes a snare for the weak. For if one makes faith everything, that is, makes it what it is, then I certainly think one may dare speak about it without risk in our age, which is scarcely extravagant in faith. And it is only by faith that one acquires a resemblance of Abraham, not by murder. If one makes love into a fleeting sentiment, a sensual feeling in a person, then one only sets traps for the weak in wanting to talk about the exploits of love. Certainly everyone has passing emotions, but if, as a result, everyone wanted to perform the frightful act that love has sanctified as an immortal feat, then everything is lost, both the exploit and the one gone astray. It is no doubt permissible, then, to speak about Abraham, for the great can never do harm when construed in its greatness. It is like a double-edged sword that kills and saves. If the lot fell on me to speak about him, I would begin by showing what a devout and God-fearing man Abraham was, worthy to be called God's chosen one. Only someone like that is put to such a test. But who is such a person? Next, I would describe how Abraham loved Isaac. To that end, I would bid all good spirits to stand by me so that my speech would be as glowing as paternal love. I hope to describe it in such a way that not many a father in the king's realms and lands would dare to claim that he loved in this way. But if he did not love as Abraham loved, then any thought of sacrificing Isaac surely would be a temptation. One could already talk about this for several Sundays. Certainly there is no need to hurry. If it were told properly, the result would be that some fathers would by no means insist on hearing more, but for the time being would be pleased if they actually succeeded in loving as Abraham loved. If there were then one who, after having heard about the greatness, but also about the frightfulness of Abraham's deed, ventured to proceed upon that trail, I would saddle my horse and ride with him. At every stop before coming to Mount Moriah, I would explain to him that he could still turn back, could repent the misunderstanding that he was called to be tried in such a conflict, could acknowledge that he lacked courage, so that God himself must take Isaac if he wanted to have him. It is my conviction that such a person is not repudiated, that he can become blessed along with everyone else, but not in time. Would not such a person be judged in this way, even in the times of the greatest faith? I knew a person who on one occasion could have saved my life if he had been magnanimous. He said plainly, "I see well enough what I could do, but I dare not do it. I am afraid that later I will lack strength and regret it." He was not magnanimous, but who for that reason would not continue to love him? Having spoken thus, and stirred the audience so they were really sensible of the dialectical struggles of faith and its gigantic passion, then I would not be guilty of an error on the part of the audience should they think, well now, he has faith to such a high degree, it is already enough for us to just hold on to his coat-tails. For I would add, by no means do I have faith. I am by nature a clever fellow, and such persons always have great difficulties in making the movement of faith, except that I certainly do not attribute in itself any worth to the difficulty which brought the clever fellow no further by overcoming it than to the point where the simplest and most innocent person arrives more easily. Love surely has its priests in the poets, and occasionally one hears a voice that knows how to honor it, but on faith not a word is heard. Who speaks in honor of this passion? Philosophy goes further. Theology sits by the window all made up and courts its favor, offering to sell its delights to philosophy. It is said to be difficult to understand Hegel, but to understand Abraham is a small matter. To go beyond Hegel is a miracle, but to manage Abraham is the easiest thing of all. I, for one, have devoted considerable time to understanding the Hegelian philosophy. I believe also that I have understood it fairly well, and I am foolhardy enough to think that when I cannot understand him in certain passages in spite of the effort applied, then probably he himself has not been entirely clear. All this I do easily, naturally, without getting a headache from it. However, When I must think about Abraham, I am virtually annihilated. At every moment I am aware of that prodigious paradox which is the content of Abraham's life. At every moment I am repelled, and in spite of all its passion, my thought cannot penetrate it, cannot make a hair's breadth of headway. I strain every muscle to get perspective, and at the same instant I become paralyzed. I am not unacquainted with what has been admired as great and magnanimous in the world. My soul feels an affinity with it, and in all humility is convinced that it was my cause too, for which the hero struggled. And in a moment of meditation I cry out to myself, now your interest is at stake. I think myself into the hero. I cannot think myself into Abraham. When I reach that height, I fall down, since what is offered to me is a paradox. Yet by no means do I therefore think faith is something lowly, but on the contrary, that it is the highest, plus that it is dishonest of philosophy to prefer something else instead and to make light of faith. Philosophy cannot and must not bestow faith, but must understand itself and know what it has to offer and take nothing away, and, least of all, trick people out of something by making them think it is nothing. I am not unacquainted with life's hardships and dangers. I fear them not, and go to meet them dauntlessly. I am not unfamiliar with the frightful. My memory is a faithful spouse, and my imagination is what I myself am not, a busy little maid who sits quietly all day at her work, and in the evening knows how to chatter so prettily to me that I have to look at it, even though it is not always just landscapes or flowers or idyllic pastoral scenes she paints. I have looked the frightful in the eye. I do not timidly flee from it, but know very well that even if I approach it bravely, my courage still is not the courage of faith, and is nothing to be compared with that. I cannot make the movement of faith. I cannot shut my eyes and plunge confidently into the absurd. That for me is an impossibility, but I do not praise myself for it. I am convinced that God is love. This thought has for me a primordial lyrical validity. When it is present to me, I am unspeakably happy. When it is absent, I long for it more intensely than the lover for the object of his love. But I do not believe. This courage I lack. To me, God's love, both in a direct and inverse sense, is incommensurable with the whole of actuality. I am not cowardly enough, therefore, to whine and wail, but neither am I perfidious enough to deny that faith is something much higher. I can well endure living in my own fashion. I am happy and content, but my joy is not that of faith, and in comparison with that is really unhappy. I do not trouble God with my petty cares. The particular does not concern me. I gaze only at my love and keep its virginal flame pure and clear. Faith is convinced that God is concerned about the least thing. I am content in this life to be wedded to the left hand. Faith is humble enough to ask for the right. For that it is humility. I do not and shall never deny. I wonder, is anyone in my age actually capable of making the movements of faith? Unless I am very much mistaken, it is rather inclined to be proud of doing what it presumably does not even believe me capable of, that is, the imperfect. It goes against the grain for me to do what so often happens, to speak inhumanely about the great as if a few millennia were an immense distance. I prefer to speak humanly about it, as if it happened yesterday, and let only the greatness itself be the distance that either exalts or condemns. If I then, in the capacity of a tragic hero, for I cannot become higher, were summoned to such an extraordinary royal progression as the one to Mount Moriah, I know very well what I would have done. I would not have been cowardly enough to stay home, nor lagged and loafed along the road, nor forgotten the knife in order that there might be a little delay. I am fairly certain I would have arrived there on the dot and had everything in order. More than likely, I would probably have arrived too early in order to get it over with sooner. But I also know what else I would have done. The moment I mounted the horse, I would have said to myself, now all is lost. God demands Isaac. I sacrifice him, and with him all my joy. Yet God is love, and continues to be that for me. For in temporality, God and I cannot converse. We have no language in common. Perhaps someone or other in our age would be foolish enough and envious enough of the great to want to make himself and me believe that if I had actually done this, I would then have done something even greater than what Abraham did, for my immense resignation would be far more ideal and poetic than Abraham's pettiness. And yet this is the greatest falsehood, for my immense resignation would be a substitute for faith. I could not make more than the infinite movement in order to find myself and once again be in equilibrium. Nor could I have loved Isaac as Abraham loved him. That I was determined to make the movement I could prove my courage, humanly speaking. That I loved him with my whole heart is a precondition without which the whole thing becomes a misdeed. But I still did not love as Abraham did, for I would have held back at the last minute, without therefore arriving too late at Mount Moriah. Furthermore, I would have spoiled the whole story by my conduct, for if I had received Isaac again, I would then have been in an awkward position. What came easiest for Abraham would have been difficult for me. Once again, to be joyful with Isaac. For whoever has made the infinite movement with all the infinity of his soul, of his own accord, and on his own responsibility, and cannot do more, only keeps Isaac with pain. But what did Abraham do? He arrived neither too early nor too late. He mounted the ass and rode slowly along the way. During all this time he believed. He believed that God would not demand Isaac of him, while he still was willing to sacrifice him if it was demanded. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for human calculation was out of the question, and it was indeed absurd that God, who demanded it of him, in the next instant would revoke the demand. He climbed the mountain, and even at the moment when the knife gleamed, he believed that God would not demand Isaac. He was no doubt surprised then at the outcome, but by a double movement he had regained his original condition and therefore received Isaac more joyfully than the first time. Let us go further. We let Isaac be sacrificed. Abraham believed. He did not believe that he would be blessed one day in the hereafter, but that he would become blissfully happy here in the world. God could give him a new Isaac, call the sacrificed one back to life. He believed by virtue of the absurd, for all human calculation had long since ceased. That sorrow can make a person mentally deranged is apparent and hard enough. That there is a willpower which can pull so drastically to the windward that it rescues the understanding even though the person becomes a little peculiar is also apparent. I do not mean to disparage that, but to be able to lose one's understanding, and along with it the whole of finitude, whose stockbroker it is, and then, by virtue of the absurd, to recover precisely the same finitude, that appalls my soul. But I do not for that reason say that it is something insignificant when, on the contrary, it is the only miracle. One generally thinks that what faith produces is not a work of art, but a coarse and crude piece of workmanship, only for the more uncultured natures. But it is far different. The dialectic of faith is the finest and most remarkable of all. It has an elevation of which I can certainly form a conception, but nothing more. I can make the great trampoline leap whereby I pass over into infinity. My spine is like a tightrope walker, twisted from my childhood. Thus it is easy for me to go 1, 2, 3, and turn a somersault in existence. But the next movement I cannot make. For the miraculous I cannot perform, but only be amazed by it. Indeed, if at the moment Abraham swung his leg over the ass's back, he had said to himself, "Now Isaac is lost. I could just as well sacrifice him here at home as travel the long way to Moriah. Then I do not need Abraham, whereas I now bow before his name 7 times and before his deed 70 times. This he has not in fact done, which I can prove by his being delighted to receive Isaac back, truly inwardly delighted, and by his needing no preparation, no time to collect himself in finitude and its joy. If that was not the case with Abraham, then he perhaps loved God but did not believe. For whoever loves God without faith considers himself, but whoever loves God with faith considers God. Abraham stands at this point. The last stage he loses his sight of is infinite resignation. He actually goes further and arrives at faith, for all those caricatures of faith, the sorry, half-hearted apathy that thinks, never mind, it's not worth worrying about ahead of time. The paltry hope that says, one can't know what will happen. It still might be possible. Those caricatures are native to the wretchedness of life and have already been infinitely disdained by infinite resignation. Abraham I cannot understand. In a certain sense, I can learn nothing from him except to be amazed. If one imagines that one may be moved to believe by pondering the outcome of that story, then one cheats oneself and wants to cheat God out of the first moment of faith. One wants to suck worldly wisdom out of the paradox. Perhaps someone or other will succeed, for our age does not stop at faith, nor with its miracle of turning water into wine. It goes further and turns wine into water. Would it not be best, however, to stop at faith? And is it not shocking that everybody wants to go further? If people in our age will not abide with love, as indeed is proclaimed in various ways, what is it all coming to? To worldly shrewdness, petty calculation, to paltriness and wretchedness, to everything that can make humanity's divine origin doubtful. Would it not be best to remain standing at faith, and for the one who stands to see to it that he does not fall? For the movement of faith must constantly be made by virtue of the absurd. Yet in such a way, mind you, that one does not lose the finite, but gains it entire. For my part, I can very well describe the movements of faith, but I cannot make them. If one wants to learn how to swim, one can let oneself be suspended in a sling from the ceiling and very well go through the motions, but one is not swimming. Likewise, I can describe the movements of faith, but if I am thrown into the water, I may well swim, for I do not belong among waders. But I make different movements. I make the movements of infinity, whereas faith does the opposite. After having made the movements of infinity, it makes those of finitude. Anyone who can make these movements is fortunate. He performs the miraculous, and I shall never become tired of admiring him. It makes absolutely no difference to me whether it is Abraham or a slave in Abraham's house, a professor of philosophy or a poor servant girl. I look only at the movements. But I do pay attention to them, and do not permit myself to be fooled, either by myself or by some other person. The knights of infinite resignation are easy to recognize. Their gait is airy, bold. However, those who carry the treasure of faith easily deceive, because their external appearance has a striking resemblance to that which both infinite resignation and faith deeply disdain, to bourgeois Philistinism. I candidly admit that in my experience I have not found any authentic exemplar, although I do not for that reason deny that possibility every other person is such an exemplar. Nevertheless, I have sought in vain for the several years to track one down. People generally travel around the world to see rivers and mountains, new stars, flamboyant birds, freakish fish, ludicrous breeds of humanity. They abandon themselves to the brutish stupor that gawks at existence, and think they have seen something. This does not occupy me. However, if I knew where such a knight of faith lived, I would travel on foot to him, for this miracle concerns me absolutely. I would not leave him an instant, but every minute pay attention to how he went about making movements. I would consider myself settled for life, and divide my time between watching him and practicing the maneuvers myself, and thus spend all my time admiring him. As I said, I have not found such a person. Nevertheless, I can very well imagine him. Here he is. The acquaintance is made. I am introduced to him. The moment I first set eyes on him, that very instant, I thrust him away from me, jump back, clap my hands together, and say half aloud, "Dear me! Is this the person? Is it actually him? He looks just like a tax collector." Nevertheless, it really is him. I draw a little closer to him and pay attention to the slightest movement to see whether a little heterogeneous fraction of a signal from the infinite manifests itself. A glance, an air, a gesture, a sadness, a smile that betrayed the infinite in its heterogeneity with the finite. No, I examine his figure from head to foot to see there might not be a crack through which the infinite peeped out. No, he is solid through and through. His footing, it is sturdy, belonging entirely to finitude. No dressed-up citizen going out on a Sunday afternoon to Fredericksburg treads the ground more solidly. He belongs entirely to the world. No bourgeois Philistine could belong to it more. Nothing is delectable of that foreign and noble nature by which the night of infinite resignation is recognized. He enjoys and takes part in everything, and whenever one sees him participating in something particular, it is carried out with a persistence that characterizes the worldly person whose heart is attached to such things. He goes about his work. To see him, one would think he was a pen-pusher who had lost his soul in Italian bookkeeping, so exact he is. He takes a holiday on Sundays. He goes to church. No heavenly look or any sign of the incommensurable betrays him. If one did not know him, it would be impossible to distinguish him from the rest of the crowd, for at most his hearty, vigorous hymn singing proves that he has a good pair of lungs. In the afternoon, he takes a walk in the woods. He enjoys everything he sees, the throngs of people, the new omnibuses, the sound. To meet him on the bench road, one would think he was a mercenary soul taking a break just to enjoy himself in this way. For he is not a poet, and I have sought in vain to pick up any poetic incommensurability in him. Towards evening he goes home. His gait is undaunted as a postman's. On the way he thinks about an appetizing little dish of warm food his wife surely has for him when he comes home. For example, a roast head of lamb with vegetables. If he were to meet a kindred spirit, he would continue conversing with him all the way to Osterport about this dish with a passion befitting a restaurateur. As it happens, he does not have 4 beans, and yet he firmly believes that his wife has that delectable dish for him. If she has it, to see him eat would be an enviable sight for distinguished people, and an inspiring one for the common man, for his appetite is heartier than Esau's. If his wife doesn't have it, oddly enough, it is all the same to him. On the way he goes past a building site and meets another man. They talk a moment together. In no time he erects a building, having at his disposal all the resources required for that purpose. The stranger leaves him thinking he was surely a capitalist, while my admired knight thinks, well, if it came to that, I could easily get it. He lounges by an open window and surveys the square where he lives. Everything that happens, a rat scurrying under a gutter plank, children playing, everything engages him with a composure in existence as if he were a girl of 16. And yet he is no genius, for I have sought in vain to spy out the incommensurability of genius in him. He smokes his pipe in the evening. To see him, one would swear it was the local tradesman across the way, vegetating in the twilight. He lets things take their course, and with a freedom from care, as if he were a reckless, good-for-nothing, and yet buys every moment he lives at the opportune time for the dearest price, for he does not do even the slightest thing except by virtue of the absurd.